Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Wednesday webinar with the Property Law Alliance. And welcome, Bruno and Silna. How are you guys doing, Silna?
I'm very good, thank you. I'm in the beautiful Cape Town, so if I look over my laptop, I am actually looking at the waterfront and the harbour, and I'm seeing the ocean. Unfortunately, I've been too busy to actually go to the ocean, so I'll be back in Joburg without actually having my feet touch sea sand, but still I'm here with the mountain right at my back, so I'm a very happy camper in my second favorite city.
Can't you just make a quick little stop and
don't you? Bruno, if you can convince everybody in Cape Town to give me like a 10-minute break, I might. But unfortunately, or happily, I have back-to-back meetings. So, but I can send them in your direction for the consultations, and I can go hang out on the beach. Is that cool?
Instead of going to the gym, just go for a jog.
Don't be weird now. Let's not be drastic. Let's not, pick the beach over gym here.
Oh my goodness. But I'm glad you're doing well. Bruno, how are you?
I'm good. I'm not in Cape Town, so I could be better. I was told that today was also about bringing awareness to gender-based violence, if I'm not mistaken. Am I right?
I have. Yes, I have actually heard something like that over the radio this morning. So, yes, I think you're correct.
Well, Chirag made me wear all black. I couldn't find a black shirt, so I tried.
Even me.
There you go.
Not me. All right. Oh, but I'm glad you guys are doing well. Thank you for joining me. And then to all our viewers, we're pre-recording today as a result of schedules, but we will be posting this video at 6 tonight. All right, so I want to give you guys a scenario where a farm was bought on an auction. Now, there's various occupants staying on the farm. They've been employed by the seller previously. However, the offer to purchase doesn't require vacant occupation of the farm. Now, some of the occupants has been living there for 18 years, some of them only 6 years. If you can maybe just discuss whose responsibility it is to bring the eviction proceedings and how do you go about it? I don't know, Silna, do you maybe want to get started on this one?
Yes, I'm happy. I think it's going to be pretty much, we'll take up the entire episode because this is actually such a loaded question. There are so many elements. I think when we get to the difference here between different pieces of legislation, I will go into that. But I think for the moment, the starting point is actually a very good question. Who is responsible to bring that eviction? Now, Bruno, I think, now look at me throwing the question straight back to you, but if the OTP, well, if it was an auction sale, typically I don't expect a provision to force the seller to give vacant occupation. I mean, most of the times on auction sales, vacant occupation isn't guaranteed. So in a situation like that, do you maybe want to go into that and then you can pass him back when we get to the legislation comparisons, the boring stuff.
Sure, thanks so much. So what I found recently is that private auction houses are also trying to pass the buck sometimes when it comes to vacant occupation of land. In the past, it used to be different, where the seller always undertook the responsibility of giving the occupation through. So if it's a sale and execution by way of a sheriff, that's always been that the purchaser undertakes the responsibility and no risk is held by the sheriff. So you buy the way that it is and you have to go evict the person. As far as private auctions are concerned, it can differ. But traditionally, I find that normal urban areas, the responsibility still stays with the seller. But in some problem cases, it's made very express that any unlawful occupiers are taken care of by the purchaser. And sometimes that's why you find that the properties sell for less. But the purchaser would have had to be aware of this before buying the property because it's quite a big one.
Yes, and I think what's very interesting and potentially problematic for this particular purchaser is the difference here between pi and ester. So if you and I speak about pi and ester, we know exactly what we're talking about. I think a lot of our viewers will be like, what is the Cape Town weather doing to Silna? Goodness, too much fresh air, and she start using abbreviations like it's nobody's business. So pi, I think everybody's heard about pi, the Prevention of Illegal Evictions Act. That is the act that we use when we do our typical residential eviction, where the occupant is in illegal occupation. Whether he had a right at some stage to occupy is irrelevant. By the moment we bring the eviction application, occupant is in illegal occupation, either by virtue of a cancelled agreement or another cancellation of any sort of right of occupation the occupant might have had. ESTA is the extension of Security of Tenure Act. Completely different piece of legislation. And Bruno, you know, I am one of the few attorneys, as you and Greg, that's willing to admit when we misinterpret stuff. And way back when I started doing the training for the Law Society on evictions, I had the whole pi ester thing a little incorrect. I had it that pi and ester was similar, had similar effects on evictions, and it was just on different types of land and a different kind of occupier. Where I'm older and wiser now, and I can admit that my interpretation was a little off accurate, because the truth about ester is it's nothing like pi. Pi is there to set out the rules and the requirements to obtain an eviction order. ester, on the other hand, it's the extension of Security of Tenure Act, not how we do evictions. This piece of legislation actually creates a right stronger than just a right of occupation. And it's not actually a piece of legislation dealing with how we do evictions. It is a piece of legislation that gives a right to a property to a certain kind of person on a certain kind of property. So where I was wrong is that ester is nothing like pi. And that is the way it is. ester is a piece of legislation that applies to specific kind of land, specific kind of occupier. Pi the same, but pi is easy. Pi applies to any land in the Republic of South Africa. Any. Rural, urban, peri-urban, we don't care. Any piece of land, pi applies to, and your occupant must be an occupant that uses the property for permanent or temporary shelter, so only residential, but the occupant is an illegal occupant. So it could have been a tenant that stopped paying and we cancelled the lease agreement, rendering the occupant's occupation illegal, or a random person, like if I don't leave this flat tomorrow and my plane goes back to Joburg and I hang out here, I'm an illegal occupier. I never had an agreement to be here, but I will have to be evicted on pi. Bruno, will you evict me?
There's actually a very interesting thing on that, by the way, but we can maybe do that later or next week. But yeah, go on.
And so something very important is when it comes to ester, it applies only to rural or peri-urban land. So the zoning of the land isn't really that relevant. It has to be rural or peri-urban land, but I'll give it back to you just now on the exception of that. But also the occupier. So the occupier isn't an illegal occupant. The occupier in terms of ester is a person who had consent to reside on the land. Now, this is important for the benefit of our viewers, the difference between consent and illegal occupant or an agreement. So an agreement, as you would see under pi, that was cancelled. So an agreement of sort that gave somebody the right of occupation that was then cancelled isn't consent, because an agreement requires counter performance, be it in the form of payment of rent, or even be it in the form of you work for me, and instead of paying you this salary, I pay you less, but I also give you a right of occupation on the premises or something like that. That is an agreement. Consent is something that doesn't require counter performance. So consent in terms of ESTA is typically the farm worker and his family that was allowed to reside on this land, not as part of their employment. Obviously, there is an element of the employment had something to do with why they received the consent, but it wasn't incorporated, for instance, as part of the employment contracts or something like that. So the person had consent, and now suddenly the consent was cancelled, but we need to remove the people from the land. Now the problem is, in terms of ESTA, sale of the property doesn't affect this right. So somebody that's been residing on the land with consent, if that property is sold, as in your question, Marilee, that consent carries through the transfer, and it gets more exciting. It carries through generations. So if my dad had consent to reside on land, and I am also then residing through and under him, even if he passed away, I still maintain that consent, provided that I didn't leave the property. So rural, peri-urban land that's not encircled by a township, and the occupant had consent, and at this stage, the occupant receives a salary of less than 12,000 Rand a month. The moment the occupant, even if he had consent, now receives a salary of more than 12,000 Rand a month, falls away from the ambit of ESTA and becomes a normal PI person to evict. So that's just the basics of the difference between the two pieces of legislation. But the problem with this is, Marilee, I don't know if this is something we've discussed before the time, or that you actually mentioned in the question. You were talking about one of the occupants that's been at the property for a long period of time and is over the age of 70, hey?
Yes, you're correct. He's been there for 18 years and he's in his 70s.
So something very interesting about ESTA is, Bruno, I love your face every time. The way Marilee says that, you're like, that is, I just, again, for the benefit of our viewers, just do your face again, please. Okay, I'll tell this story. So, Bruno, somebody's staying on rural or peri-urban land for 18 years, and they are over the age of 65.
I can't do that.
No, you can't do that. But what I wanted to demonstrate is the only time we get nervous is when an eviction lawyer pulls their face. That is the moment where you're like, oh, you know, wrong place, wrong time. And the reason why we're pulling our faces like that is, ESTA says, if somebody's been residing on land with consent, rural or peri-urban land with consent, for a period exceeding 10 years, and that person is now over the age of 65, he has a right of occupation on that land. As simple as that. Now, we can argue for days on end whether that's reasonable or not. Remember, reasonable in law sits on both parties. So somebody's been there, he's worked his entire life on the farm, and we don't really want to see a farm worker when he goes on pension, which pension, let's all just be a little realistic here. Typical farm worker doesn't have his own pension, it's government pension, which is not a lot of money. To now put that person off the farm after he spent his life on the farm, there is seriously two sides to this point that we need to consider. But for you as the purchaser of rural or peri-urban land, if you bought that property on auction and there are people that had consent to reside there, even if you feel, oh my goodness, but it wasn't a me problem, it is a you problem now. And you need to remember that that person has a right now to reside on the land by way of legislation. So you can't evict him. because he has a right to occupy the land. So when you buy a property and it is rural or peri-urban, your due diligence has to take a whole new angle.
Yeah.
You need to know who's residing on the land, how long they've been residing there, on which basis have they resided there. And if you need to get to a point where you need full vacant occupation of the premises, you need to appreciate that when you need to remove one of those people from the farm that actually has a right in terms of ESTA, the only way you can do that is an actual agreed relocation. We've done quite a few of those, especially around the Lanseria area and actually in Cape Town as well. Outside, more towards Blouberg side. Look at me now pointing. It's convenient when I'm here because then I can see Blouberg from here, so I can actually point there. So in that area where you have to physically relocate the people, and they have a right to say, I am willing to relocate on this basis or not, because they have a right. Everybody else, especially when you start relocation negotiations, suddenly people that hasn't been on the farm for like 20 years reappear miraculously, like, hey, I also want to be relocated. So it's very important to take proper inventory when you buy the property to know who the actual people are, because the moment you voluntarily vacate the premises, you can't come back and rely on ESTA to give you a right of occupation. So that's just quickly the difference between buy and ESTA. And Marelli, from what you are saying, unfortunately, I think this purchase bought land with a lot of ESTA occupants. Even the people that doesn't have a right of occupation under ESTA, so people under the age of 65 or people that's been there for less than 10 years, the relocation and the eviction can be done, definitely, but it's a very different process, much longer than PI and a PI eviction. Let's ballpark unopposed. You can look at about 2 to 3 months at this stage with the congested court rolls. Where under ESTA, if you are lucky and it's quick, you're going to look at about 18 months to 12 years, because you need to involve a social worker. Pets and animals, livestock is actually part of ESTA. So you need to do a proper full report about how many chickens, how many cows, how many scorpies, bookies, everything. And you need to bring that into the eviction, which, I mean, it's the weirdest thing for us as typical PI eviction people, to think that you need to bring I mean, we're used to telling the court about disabled, elderly, women-headed households and children and the PI, but if you now have to bring in how many sheep
Cows
we have,
and goats,
5 chickens, it's a very different sort of eviction, and you typically have to approach the marriage court or the land claims court with this. It's a long, painful process. So before you buy, you need to do due diligence. But so that's the practical side of it. But Bruno, I think something very important is, if you are looking at a property like that, maybe you can just help out, or if you own land like that, maybe you can go into a lot more detail about how an owner can secure staying away from ESTA, even by giving somebody a house or something because he's working for you, something like that maybe.
So just building on what you've been discussing, so for starters, so that not everyone loses faith in the system, there are some even with long-term occupiers, you may be able to terminate the occupation, like Silna mentioned, obviously by relocation, but their behavior is also something that people would consider. It's not necessarily an easy process, because now the onus is very difficult to prove that somebody is is mala fide. So there's certain behavioral traits where there's harm to others, damage to the property, etc., that does count as an exception. So that's just something for this client or this viewer to remember. Although at this junction, it's a bit difficult because the decision now being made is whether you should actually go ahead with the sale or not. And if we are looking at a due diligence process, I know that transfer is about to take place, but maybe just take one step back, go to a firm that actually understands evictions, and spend a little money just to do an audit. You know, you run certain processes by, I mean, we've done it before in countless occasions, but even under PI, where you try to figure out, you know, who's on the property, how many people are per room, which syndicate has control of this place, because there's a whole bunch of like underlying issues that a person might find. So a little investigation, there's a couple of people that are very comfortable going into environments like that, counting, double checking, because you may find maybe it's 2 people. And you go, you know, 2 people, it's a very large piece of land. It's still worth it. Is this the biggest issue ever? Because remember, again, under PI, you're dealing with a house. So it's almost the intensity differs. Under ESTER, you're looking at far more intense processes because you need to give longer time frames. There's more to consider. You're dealing with generally and typically people that aren't very educated. So you thought PI was bad, like here comes ESTER. But the intensity is also very different. If you're on a farmland that's very, very big, and typically, you know, your residential suburban places, you're looking at a house, for example, that house is taken up. So that's very intense. So when you do your due diligence, you're worried about one person in that house that won't get out. With ESTER, slightly different because there are still other portions of the farm that can be used. So that's just something to consider, from a due diligence perspective. And then just another point I wanted to make was be careful, guys. So ESTER, so ESTER obviously applies for the more rural areas, but there are certain agricultural areas where ESTER, where the application of ESTER will also apply. And not necessarily in those typical rural areas. So we also need to be careful because, like Silna pointed out so correctly, it's those farm workers that they're trying to protect. So again, when you're doing your research, when you're trying to figure out whether to buy a property or not, and if there are occupiers on the property, what sort of process you need to follow. You need to look at the type of land, make a judgment call. Is it in a township? Is it very close to a proclaimed township, or is it very far off? And if it is very close, also just try and establish, is it for agricultural purposes? Zoning doesn't really matter. It's more the actual purpose for which it's used that kind of plays the part there. So that could definitely help with the due diligence side of things.
And I think you touched on something very important now, Bruno. We actually had a consultation. What day is it? Wednesday. I lost count of this week. But we had a consultation on Monday, actually, with a client, a referral from another firm. The reason why the firm referred it to us was because they said it's an ESTER eviction, definitely an ESTER eviction, because it's on farmland. And when we actually looked at the thing, the person that's in occupation is in occupation in terms of an installment sale agreement. Right, so it was one of the farm workers who bought the property when the farmer left on an installment sale agreement. But that's no longer an ESTER occupant. That is a PI eviction. That's a straight out PI eviction. Installment sale agreement, lease agreement, sale agreement. Even if that agreement is with one of the people that would have been an ESTER occupant, the fact that there was another contract in place that takes the consent element away and draws it into a contractual basis, that changes the legislation that governs the thing. And I think this is one of those moments where I think we need to appreciate that lawyers are a pretty unique species, because something that could be legislated by this piece of legislation for this moment, you change the fact slightly and there's another piece of legislation and everybody's like, but I thought farmland is an ESTER eviction. No, there's so much more to it, which once again, like you said just earlier, you referred to go to a firm that understands evictions. To your point, this is where you go from general sort of property law into serious expert levels for us. I mean, you and I are, it's easy to know when which piece of legislation applies. You give us 3 facts, we ask 7 more questions and we get the answer. Where I think if we have this conversation around another part of the law, say for instance labor law, whatever, I'm not well versed at all. Yeah, see, nothing. So it's a very specialized part of the law that's not as simple to understand. So I don't know how many of our viewers we lost throughout this conversation. I really hope we kept it as simple and high level as potentially possible, but it's unfortunately a very complex part of the law. So we might have been a little weird on the detail and assumptions of what what people know about PI and ESTA. But I think to go into a lot more detail is going to be a full day session.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we need to bear in mind now that there are going to be a lot of properties coming onto the market. People are going to take opportunities to try buy different things, try different things. I mean, it's what's happening with COVID. They want alternatives, so everyone's going to explore things that they would never typically explore. And I think, and I know that there's a lot, even like on the property practitioner side, there's a lot of guys out there getting involved in properties and taking opportunities that they don't truly understand. And for an estate agent taking a mandate going, great, well, let me sell a bunch of properties. One of them happens to be a farmland. It's dangerous to do that without knowing the dangers of things like an eviction, going to a purchaser and saying, no worries, the seller will get rid of everyone, when that's simply not going to happen, or not easily anyway. And I mean, things like graveyards and that comes into place also under ESTA, which is things that you need to bear in mind. So yeah, it is quite specialized. So if you see it and that red flag hits, we don't have to speak about it necessarily every week or every second week, but that red flag kicks in, do something about it. Don't just ignore it and hope it goes away.
That's wise words, because that's the thing about an occupant that you might not want on a piece of land. By definition, they don't just go away. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had conversations every Wednesday, right? It's a very important point that you make. And I think on the back of what you're saying, just to echo what you're saying, is if you're buying a farm and you're going to pay, even if it's a bargain and it's like R1 million, if you spend R1 million on anything, at least make sure you're paying the right people for the right advice. Spend the money on a specialist eviction attorney to assess, to help you with the assessment. And I'm seriously not bad mouthing any conveyancers here, not at all. But the conveyancers doesn't know when an eviction, what kind of intricacies around evictions are. So make sure you don't just rely on the advice from the estate agent or the conveyancer or whoever. Spend the money on the right people to do your due diligence. It's going to save you thousands of rands later in the game.
Definitely. Thank you so much, guys. That was very interesting. Now, I think this is about the time that we have. So thank you so much for joining me, and to all our viewers. If you have any questions or topics which you want to discuss, please post it on our page or send us an inbox message. And then we look forward to next week's Wednesday webinar. All right. Thank you so much, guys. And thank you, Bruno and Silna.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.